My hands trembled around the pill bottle. 70 years old, and finally asking the question I should have asked long before now. Why does the medicine that's supposed to help me feel like it's stealing something? My doctor's next words emptied the room of air. Mr. Redfern, there's lead in your blood. Cadmium, too. This didn't happen from 40 years at the forge. Someone has been poisoning you. And the only person who brought me that bottle every single morning was my own son. Dr. Priscilla Okonkwo-Hale did not say it twice. She did not need to. She sat across from me with a manila folder open on her desk, a blue pen resting on top of it, and let the sentence sit in the room the way you let a hot piece of iron sit before you touch it. I heard the air conditioner cycle on somewhere behind the wall. I heard my own pulse in my ears. I did not hear myself agree to anything, but I must have, because she kept talking and I kept nodding. And none of the words after that landed anywhere I could find them again. She turned the folder toward me. 2 columns of numbers, one labeled normal range, one labeled your levels. The second column sat well outside the first, circled twice in blue ink. Lead, cadmium, both elevated enough that she said the word toxic without flinching, the way a woman says a word she has said before and will say again, but never gets used to saying, to a man she has treated for 6 years. I asked her the only question that mattered. Where does something like this come from? She said forges old paint, contaminated water, certain supplements. Then she looked at me steadily and said the sentence I would carry out of that office like a stone in my coat pocket. Mr. Redfern, have you been taking anything new? Any supplements? Anything someone else has been giving you? I thought of the little brown bottle in my truck's cup holder. The one Priya brought me 8 months ago told me it was better than the drugstore kind, gentler on an old man's stomach. The one Nathaniel set beside my coffee every single morning since a small ritual between us I had never once questioned, because a son bringing his father medicine is not a thing a man questions. It is a thing a man is grateful for. I did not say any of that out loud yet. I only said I would look into it. I drove home along the same stretch of highway I have driven for 40 years, past the turnoff to the old rail yard, past the gallery district that did not exist when I built my forge, and I did not remember a single mile of it. My hands were steady on the wheel. That was the thing I noticed. Steadier than they had been in months, as if my body had already decided something my mind had not caught up to yet. I am Augustus Redfern. Gus, if you have known me longer than 10 minutes. I am 70 years old, and for 40 years I have run a blacksmith shop on the edge of Marfa, Texas, the kind of town where art galleries and cattle ranches sit close enough to share a fence line. I did not make horseshoes. I made gates for ranch houses, railings for gallery staircases, sculptures that ended up in courtyards from El Paso to Santa Fe. I learned to read iron before I learned to read most books, and I have spent 4 decades listening to metal the way other men listen to weather. 3 years ago, my hands started shaking. Not dramatically, just enough to miss a measurement to overheat a weld to make me set the hammer down more carefully than I used to. The doctor back then called it early arthritis, aggravated by decades of impact work. And I believed her, because it was the explanation that made sense. It was the explanation everyone around me was happy to believe too. My wife Marisol used to say, "A man who works with his hands eventually pays for it with his hands." She said it fondly, the way you say something true about someone you love. She has been gone 22 years now, and I still hear her say it some mornings, standing at the forge, with my palms flat against the cold anvil, before I have the nerve to light the fire. The house I live in, the workshop behind it, they have been mine since before Marisol and I married. Between the shop's income over the decades and what we saved, I am comfortable. not wealthy. Comfortable enough to help my son when he needed it. Comfortable enough to feel like 40 years of work meant something. Nathaniel is 38 now. He tried the forge for 2 years in his 20s before deciding it was not for him. And I never held that against him, not once. He runs a gallery now with his wife Priya out on the edge of town. The kind of clean, modern space that sells the sculptures I can no longer finish. I was proud of him for finding his own path. I am still proud of him. That is the part that makes what comes next so hard to say out loud. Even now. Even to you. Because sitting in my truck outside Dr. Hale's office, engine off, both hands resting on the wheel, I understood something I did not want to understand. The tremor everyone called arthritis had started getting sharply worse around the same time Priya began bringing me that little brown bottle every visit, telling me it was gentler than what the pharmacy carried. Nathaniel had picked up the habit not long after setting it beside my coffee cup every morning, like it was nothing at all, like it was love. I sat there a long time before I turned the key. I did not go inside the house. I drove straight to the workshop and sat in the truck a second time, keys still in my hand, staring at the padlock on the door I had not opened without help in 3 months. The bottle was still in the cup holder. I picked it up and read the label for the first time in 8 months. Redfern Wellness Complex. No pharmacy name. No manufacturer listed anywhere on the paper. Just a barcode and a lot number stamped in faded ink, small enough that I had to hold it up to the truck's dome light to make it out clearly. I had never once looked at that label before today. A father does not inspect what his son hands him with love in both eyes. I called Nathaniel. He picked up on the second ring. Voice warm, easy. The voice he has used with me since he was small. "Hey, Dad, you eat yet?" I told him I had, which was a lie, and asked him a question I had been rehearsing the entire drive home. "Nathaniel, this wellness bottle Priya's been sending home with you, where does she get it?" There was a half-second of silence before he answered. So brief, a man not listening for it would never have caught it at all. "Some specialty supplier she found online," he said. "Why, everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I told him. "Just curious." I hung up and sat with that half-second a long time. I did not sleep that night. Instead, I pulled every receipt I could find from a metal box I kept in the office corner of the workshop. The same box I had used to track lumber costs and client invoices for 4 decades. I found 6 charges from the gallery's business account going back 11 months. Each one routed through a supplement wholesaler I had never heard of. Each one timed within a day or two of Priya's Thursday visits. 6 charges, $280 each time. I laid them out on the workbench next to the 3 sculptures I had not touched in months. The ones still wrapped in canvas in the corner. The ones Marisol sketched the year before she died. I did not unwrap them. I only stood there a long time in the workshop light, looking at the shape of them under the cloth, and thought about how a man spends 40 years learning to hear what metal is telling him, and somehow missed what his own son was handing him every morning. The next Thursday, Priya came by, like always, right on schedule, carrying a paper bag from the health food store on Highland Avenue, and the thermos of the herbal tea she made me drink twice a week. She set the bag on my kitchen counter, pulled out a fresh bottle of the wellness complex, and told me the old one was probably running low. I let her replace it. I did not say a word about the blood test. I did not say a word about the 6 charges. She asked how I was feeling, the tremor especially. And I told her about the same, maybe a little worse, and watched something pass behind her eyes that I would spend the next several weeks trying to name. Not concern exactly. Something closer to satisfaction, quickly folded away behind a smile so practiced I almost missed it entirely. She stayed 40 minutes that afternoon, the way she always did. She wiped down my counters, asked about the gallery's fall schedule, mentioned twice how tired I looked lately. Gently, the way you mention something to a man you expect to hear without pushing back. Before she left, she reminded me to take the new bottle with breakfast. 1 capsule, never 2. Her voice light and certain, a woman reciting instructions she had given 100 times before. That night, I poured the new bottle's contents into a mason jar, sealed it, and hid it inside an old paint can on the highest shelf of the workshop, behind a row of tools nobody but me had touched in years. I refilled the bottle itself with plain calcium tablets from the drugstore, close enough in size and color that no one checking quickly would notice the difference. I set it back on the kitchen counter, exactly where it always sat, label facing out. I started taking nothing the next morning. Not the real bottle, not any bottle at all. I told no one, not Nathaniel, not Des, not a single soul in Marfa. I simply stopped and began writing things down instead, the way I once tracked lumber orders and client invoices. What day, what time, how my hands felt when I woke. Before coffee, before anything else could explain it away. 3 days in, I noticed the tremor easing enough to hold a coffee cup steady for the first time in months. 5 days in, I picked up a small hand file in the workshop and managed 4 clean passes across a piece of scrap steel before my grip gave out. It was not much. To anyone else, it would have looked like nothing at all. But I had spent 40 years reading small differences in metal, and I knew the difference between nothing and something the moment I felt it. I did not tell myself what that meant yet. I only kept writing it down and waited to see how much more my hands might remember on their own. By the 10th day off the bottle, I could hold a chisel steady enough to strike it clean. And that was the day I understood exactly how much had been taken from me, and exactly how deliberately. I want to tell you what 40 years in this trade actually teaches a man, because it matters for what comes later. My father put a hammer in my hand when I was 9 years old in a shed behind our house outside Alpine, and told me, iron does not lie to you the way people do. Heat it wrong, it tells you. Strike it wrong, it tells you. You learn to listen, or you learn nothing at all. I apprenticed under him until I was 23, then took over the shop myself. Then built a second forge on the edge of Marfa when the town started filling up with galleries and money from Houston and New York people who wanted iron gates that looked like they belonged to a ranch, even if they had never set foot on one. I married Marisol Aguirre the year I turned 26. She was a painter, sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who could look at a half-finished piece of ironwork and tell you exactly what it wanted to become before I could see it myself. She used to sit in the corner of the shop with a sketchbook while I worked, sketching the pieces before they existed, and more often than not, what came out of the fire matched her drawing, closer than my own plan had. She died 22 years ago. Cancer fast 11 months from the day we found it to the day I buried her. I kept working through all of it because a man in this trade learns that grief and iron can share the same room if you let the iron do most of the talking. 3 pieces sat unfinished in the corner of my shop the day I sat there counting how many clean strikes I could manage. Marisol had sketched all 3 the year before she died. 3 companion sculptures meant for the old courthouse square, each one built around a different piece of scrap steel I had pulled from a demolition site 15 years back. I never told anyone where that steel came from. I never told anyone why I could not seem to finish them, no matter how many years passed. Every time I got close, my hands would find a reason to stop. That demolition site belonged to a strip of county land that got rezoned under questionable paperwork 15 years ago, back when I was still young enough to notice things I had no proof of and no standing to say out loud. I kept 3 pieces of that torn-up steel because Marisol asked me to before she knew why, before either of us knew what those 3 pieces would end up meaning. I never explained it to Nathaniel. He was 12 at the time and had no reason to ask. Nathaniel tried the trade for 2 years after high school, standing where I am standing now, learning to hold a hammer the way I taught him. He was good with his hands. He simply did not love the work the way it needs to be loved. And I never blamed him for that, not once. Not even the day he told me he was leaving the shop to help run a gallery instead. A man chooses his own trade. He met Priya 6 years ago at an art fair in Marathon and married her within 14 months. She came into this family with a business degree, a sharp eye for placement and pricing, and a habit of visiting me every Thursday afternoon that started almost the day after the wedding. In the 6 years since, she had asked about those 3 unfinished pieces more times than I could count, always framed the same gentle way. "Have you thought about just letting them go, Gus? A collector would pay real money for scrap that old, finished or not." I always told her no. I never told her why. I picked up the chisel again on the 10th day and struck it clean 4 times before my hand betrayed even a flicker. 4 clean strikes. I had not managed one in 8 months. I went back to the metal box in the office corner and pulled the 6 receipts again. Laid them beside the calendar Priya kept updating with her Thursday visits, and matched every single charge to a date on that calendar within 48 hours. Every time, without exception. I set the receipts down and looked at the 3 shrouded shapes in the corner. And for the first time since Marisol died, I let myself think the sentence all the way through instead of stopping halfway. Someone did not want these finished. Someone had been making very sure of that for a long time, and the timing told me exactly who had been making sure. I went back through 11 months of the calendar, a second time slower, checking each entry against bank records I had pulled from the drawer. Every Thursday visit lined up with a charge, either the same day or the day before. Never later, as if the bottle needed to be fresh in my hand before the next one arrived. 11 months, 44 visits by my count, and 41 charges matched cleanly against them. 3 did not match at all, and I circled those 3 dates twice. The same way I used to circle a supplier's error on an invoice, back when a missed decimal point could cost a man a friendship built over 20 years. I did not know yet what those 3 uneven dates meant. I only knew they mattered the way an odd weld mark matters before you understand what caused it. I unwrapped the first sculpture that same afternoon for the first time in 3 years. The canvas came away stiff with dust, and underneath it the steel looked exactly as I had left it. A curved spine of torn metal, half formed into something that might have been a wing or a blade, or neither. Marisol's sketch called it witness. I had never asked her what it was witnessing. I had only trusted that she knew, the way I trusted the weight of a hammer before I understood the physics of it. I picked up the smallest chisel on the bench, the one I used for detail work, fine lines, the kind of cut that requires a hand steady enough to trust itself completely. I set the edge against the steel, where Marisol's sketch showed a seam that still needed opening, took a breath, and struck. My hand held. 1 strike, then another. Then a third, cleaner than the last, and on the 4th, my grip gave out. All at once the chisel skittering sideways and gouging a line across the metal. I had not intended ruining. Nothing important, but reminding me exactly how far I still had to climb back. I set the tools down on the bench, not gently, and stood there with both palms flat against the cold surface of the anvil, the way I had stood 100 times since Marisol died. Except this time, the stillness in my chest was not grief. It was something colder and more precise than grief. 10 days without the bottle, and I could manage 3 strikes. 8 months on the bottle, and I could not have managed 1. Someone had taken 40 years of skill out of my hands, 1 careful dose at a time, and had done it so gently, so lovingly, that I had thanked them for it every single morning. I covered the sculpture again slower this time, tucking the canvas edges the way Marisol used to tuck a blanket around Nathaniel when he was small, careful at the corners. Then I sat down on the stool beside the workbench and let myself feel the whole shape of it for the first time. Not the anger yet. That would come later, sharper and more useful, once I had something to point it at. What I felt first was simpler and worse. Betrayal has a particular weight to it, a specific gravity that settles low in the chest and does not move no matter how you breathe. I thought about Nathaniel at 7 years old, standing exactly where I was sitting now, watching me work, with his mouth slightly open, asking if the fire ever got tired. I thought about him at 12, setting the hammer down for what would turn out to be the last time, and telling me apologetically that his hands wanted to do something else. I had never once made him feel small for that. I had told him a man chooses his own trade, and I had meant it. I remembered teaching him to bank a forge fire properly, how you bury the coals just right so they hold their heat overnight without needing tending, and how proud he'd looked the one time he got it right on his own, coming down the next morning to find the fire still breathing under its blanket of ash. He was 9 that year. He brought me a cup of coffee before I'd even asked, set it on the workbench. With both hands, the careful way children carry things they're afraid to spill, and told me he'd banked it himself. I believed I would remember that morning for the rest of my life, and here I was decades later, thinking of it, while I tried to understand how the same 2 hands that once cradled a coffee cup so carefully could now be setting a bottle of poison beside my breakfast every single day. I thought about the bottle on my kitchen counter, refilled now with calcium tablets, sitting in the exact spot where Nathaniel set it every single morning before he left for the gallery. The same easy motion he had used for 8 months. A ritual he believed, as far as I could tell, was nothing but care. The label still faced outward, the way he always turned it, a small habit I had never noticed until I started watching for it. That was the part I could not get past. Sitting there in the workshop light, with the smell of cold ash and machine oil settling around me the way it always did once the forge went quiet for the night. Not what Priya had done. I had already begun to understand what Priya had done, in the cold, methodical way a man understands a bad weld once he knows what to look for. What I could not get past was whether my son knew, and if he did not, how long I had left before he found out the truth from someone other than me, and whether that truth would break him the way it was breaking me now, slowly, one clean strike at a time. I sat with that question until the light through the high window had gone from gold to gray. The workshop was quiet except for the tick of the metal roof settling as the day's heat left it, a sound I had heard 10,000 evenings and had never once needed to think about before tonight. I locked the workshop that evening and walked back to the house in the last of the light, past the tool shed my father built, past the patch of ground where Marisol used to grow tomatoes she never had the patience to water properly. The 3 sculptures stayed behind me under their canvas, quiet, waiting, the way they had waited for 22 years, for hands steady enough to finish what she had started. Nathaniel and Priya came for Friday dinner 3 days later, the way they had every week for as long as I could remember. And I made sure my hands shook exactly as much as they had the Friday before. I had spent the afternoon practicing in front of the bathroom mirror. An old man of 70, standing alone in his own house, rehearsing a tremor he no longer had. And if that sounds foolish to you, I promise you it did not feel foolish while I was doing it. I practiced lifting a glass of water and letting it wobble just slightly against my lip. I practiced the particular hesitation in my step Priya and Nathaniel had grown used to seeing. A small drag in my left foot I had exaggerated for months without realizing anyone was watching closely enough to notice, and now realized someone had been watching for exactly that reason. I had thought about it carefully. If my hand suddenly steadied after months of decline, someone paying close attention would notice. and I needed nobody paying close attention yet. So I let the fork tremble against the plate when I lifted it. I let my coffee cup rattle faintly against its saucer. I let myself seem exactly as diminished as I had seemed for months, and I watched the whole time for anything I might have missed before. Priya arrived first, carrying a covered dish of the kind of casserole she always brought, telling me it was low sodium, better for a man my age, easier on everything. She set it on the counter and hugged me the way she always did. One arm, brief, professional, in a way that had taken me years to notice as strange. Nathaniel came in behind her, with a bag of takeout from the barbecue place on Highland. The same order he always brought. Brisket and beans, because he still believed, after everything, that I could not taste the difference between a meal made with love and a meal made with obligation. We sat at the kitchen table the way we always did. Nathaniel talked about the gallery's fall opening a new sculptor from Marathon, whose work Priya had discovered at a regional show someone Priya described in careful detail. Her voice quick and bright, the way it always got when she talked about business. She mentioned the sculptor had agreed to a percentage split most artists wouldn't accept, and Nathaniel laughed and said that was Priya for you, always finding the angle nobody else saw coming. She turned to me partway through the meal, setting down her fork with the deliberate care of someone changing subjects on purpose. Everything okay with the tremor, Gus? Any changes? About the same, I told her, letting my hand shake slightly around my glass as I said it. Maybe a touch worse some mornings. She nodded slowly, the particular nod of someone receiving expected news, and reached into her bag. A new bottle, she said, setting it on the table between us. Label turned so I could read it clearly. Higher potency. My doctor friend recommended it. Specifically for tremor management. Gentler than the last formula, but stronger where it counts. I looked at that bottle a long moment before I picked it up. Higher potency. I thought about the mason jar hidden in the paint can on the highest shelf of my workshop, and the calcium tablet sitting in the old bottle on my counter. And I understood, looking at this new one, that whatever had been happening to me for 11 months was not slowing down. If anything, it was accelerating, and I wondered, turning the bottle over in my trembling hand, whether that acceleration meant something had changed on their end, too. Some deadline I did not yet know about. Thank you, sweetheart, I said, and set it beside my plate the way I always did, and watched something pass behind her eyes that I had started to recognize now that I knew to look for it. Not warmth exactly. Something closer to satisfaction. The particular satisfaction of watching a plan proceed on schedule. Nathaniel reached over and squeezed my shoulder on his way to get more ice from the freezer, the same easy affection he had shown me my entire life, and asked, almost as an afterthought, whether I'd given any more thought to the assisted living pamphlets Priya had left on my counter last month. Just something to look at, Dad, he said. No pressure. I told him I'd looked at them, which was true, and that I wasn't ready for that conversation, which was also true. He nodded and let it go, easy as always, and I felt something crack slightly in my chest, watching him move through my kitchen so freely, so certain he belonged there, so certain nothing between us had changed. I put the new bottle in my jacket pocket, instead of leaving it on the counter, telling Priya I wanted to start it first thing in the morning. Keep it close so I wouldn't forget. She smiled at that, pleased, and turned back to her casserole, satisfied in a way that made my stomach tighten, even as I kept my own face carefully blank. I sat there through the rest of the meal, laughing at Nathaniel's stories, asking Priya about the fall, opening, my hand trembling exactly as much as it needed to, while the bottle sat against my ribs like a stone I intended to carry somewhere useful the moment they left my house. Elena came to the workshop the following Saturday with her lizard tucked under one arm and a library book about anglerfish under the other. And it was Elena, not Ruth Ferris, not Dr. Hale, who told me the first thing that made my stomach drop straight through the floor. She was 8 years old, sharp as a tack, and utterly incapable of understanding that some things are not meant to be repeated. She climbed onto her usual stool near the workbench, set Ember down beside her, with the careful ceremony of a child placing a king on a chessboard, and looked at the 3 shrouded sculptures in the corner with the particular seriousness she gave everything that mattered to her. The same seriousness she brought to sorting her crayons by exact shade, or explaining, at length, why anglerfish deserved more respect than people gave them. "Grandpa Gus," she said, "are you going to finish those before you have to sell the shop?" I kept my hands moving, wiping down a chisel I did not need to wipe down, and asked her, as lightly as I could manage, where she had heard something like that. "Daddy was talking to Uncle Aldo on the phone," she said, already losing interest, already reaching for a scrap of wire to bend into a shape only she understood. He said something about the gallery needing more space, and Uncle Aldo said he had a buyer already lined up if the shop ever became available. She looked up at me, tilting her head the exact way her father used to as a boy, working through a problem he didn't yet have words for. "What does 'became available' mean?" I told her it meant nothing important, and asked if she wanted hot cocoa, and she said yes, without looking up from the wire, already halfway into an explanation of anglerfish mating behavior that would carry us both through the next 20 minutes without either of us needing to return to the subject. I want to tell you something about that moment, because it matters more than almost anything else I will tell you. I had a choice sitting right there in front of me. I could have called Nathaniel that same afternoon and asked him directly what a buyer lined up for my shop was supposed to mean. I could have driven straight to Aldo Reyes's office above the feed store where he ran what he called consulting for regional property, a business I had always assumed meant helping ranchers subdivide land for tax purposes, and demanded he explain himself to my face. I knew Aldo well enough to nod to on the street. He had lived in Marfa longer than Priya had been alive, ran his consulting out of a single rented room with a view of the water tower, and had a reputation, quiet but persistent, for knowing which parcels of land were about to change hands before the owners themselves fully understood it. I had never once connected his name to anything involving my family until an 8-year-old handed me the connection without meaning to. I did neither of those things I could have done. I did not call Nathaniel. I did not drive to Aldo's office. I told myself I needed more information first. I told myself a direct confrontation now, before I understood the full shape of what was happening, would only warn them I already suspected something, and cost me whatever advantage my silence still gave me. Both of those reasons were true, but underneath them sat an older, quieter reason I did not examine closely enough that day. The same reason that had kept me quiet 15 years ago, when I first understood what that rezoned county land had actually meant. I had spent my whole life believing that patience was a kind of strength, that a man who waited long enough eventually got to see the truth clearly, without needing to force it into the open before it was ready. I made Elena's cocoa with extra marshmallows, the way she liked it, and let her win the argument about how many was too many, and watched her chatter happily at Ember about the deep sea, while some colder part of my mind was already cataloging everything she had just handed me. A buyer, already lined up. Aldo Reyes, whose name I recognized from the courthouse square rezoning 15 years ago, though I had never once heard it connected to Priya's family until this exact moment. If Aldo was involved now, the same way he had been involved then, this was not a new idea Priya and Nathaniel had stumbled into recently. This was a thread stretching back years, one I had somehow failed to notice, even while standing close enough to touch it. I did not say any of that out loud. Not to Elena, not to Nathaniel when he came to pick her up an hour later, kissing my cheek and thanking me for watching her, telling me Priya had a gallery meeting run long, some scheduling conflict he described, in the vague, cheerful way people describe things they have not asked many questions about themselves. I stood in my own doorway and watched my son's truck pull out of the driveway, my granddaughter's small hand waving from the passenger window, and I chose one more time to stay quiet and wait, telling myself the choice was strategy and not, as some smaller and more honest part of me suspected, simply fear wearing strategy's clothes. The pharmacy invoice arrived by mistake, mixed in with Nathaniel's mail after the post office flagged his box for overflow and rerouted a week's worth of correspondence to mine instead. An error so ordinary and so unremarkable that I nearly threw the whole stack into the recycling bin behind the workshop without looking twice. I did look twice. A single sheet folded in with 3 catalogs and a water bill printed on the letterhead of a compounding pharmacy 2 counties over in Fort Stockton, a place I had never once heard either of them mention. The invoice listed a monthly subscription for custom-formulated supplements, itemized in language dense enough that I had to read it 3 times before the individual components started meaning anything at all. Zinc citrate, calcium carbonate, a proprietary blend labeled only as Mineral Complex 7, no further breakdown given, priced at $280. The exact figure I recognized from the 6 charges I had already found on the gallery's account. I sat at my kitchen table with that invoice for the better part of an hour, the same yellow legal pad I used to track lumber orders open beside it. And I began doing what I had done for 40 years whenever a number refused to make sense on its own. I broke it down into pieces small enough to examine individually. I called the compounding pharmacy directly, using the excuse that I wanted to confirm my own prescription details, a lie I delivered in the mild, slightly confused voice of an old man double-checking something he'd already been told twice. The woman on the phone was patient and efficient, and when she pulled up the account under Redfern, she read back a list of ingredients that included 2 I had never heard spoken aloud in a pharmacy before. Lead acetate in trace amounts, listed under a supplier code rather than a name any layperson would recognize. Cadmium sulfate listed the same way. I asked her, keeping my voice as even and steady as I could manage, whether those were common in a mineral supplement. There was a pause on her end, brief but noticeable, the sound of someone reading something twice before answering. She said she wasn't authorized to discuss formulation specifics, only account details, and did I want her to transfer me to the pharmacist on duty. I told her that wouldn't be necessary. I thanked her. I asked one more question before hanging up as casually as I could manage, whether the account had been active long. Going on a year now, she told me, checking a date I couldn't see. Formula's been adjusted twice since it opened, most recently about 5 months back. Higher concentration on request. I hung up and sat very still in my kitchen for a long time, the way a man sits still after he has finally heard the exact word he has spent many weeks circling without letting himself say it. Adjusted twice. Higher concentration on request. Someone had not only started this, they had returned to it, checked its progress, and decided it needed strengthening. I wrote it all down on the legal pad, the way I once tracked every discrepancy in a shipment before confronting a vendor who had shorted me. The pharmacy name, the account holder, the 2 ingredients with names that had no business appearing in anything marketed as wellness. The 2 adjustment dates, 5 months back, and I would later calculate roughly around the time my tremor had noticeably worsened enough that Nathaniel first mentioned the assisted living pamphlets. I underlined the words lead acetate twice, the same way I had once underlined a missing decimal point that cost a customer $400, and cost me, eventually, that customer's trust for good. I thought about walking into that pharmacy myself and demanding answers face to face. I thought about calling Dr. Hale and reading her the ingredient list over the phone. I did neither. I had learned slowly and expensively that showing your hand before you understood the whole game had cost me more in 40 years of business than almost any other mistake I'd made. And I was not prepared to make that mistake now. Not with stakes this much higher than a lumber order. What I needed was someone who could dig further than a phone call would ever get me. Someone who knew how to find the parts of a paper trail that were never meant to be found by the person they belonged to. I folded the invoice carefully, along with my own notes, and put both in the metal box in my workshop office, beside the receipts and the calendar, and everything else I had gathered so far. I thought of a name Des had mentioned once in passing years ago over coffee. A private investigator who had helped a rancher friend of his untangle a disputed water rights case nobody else in the county wanted to touch. I did not remember her name that evening. I only remembered Des saying she was thorough and quiet, and did not care whose feelings got hurt once she found what she was looking for. I decided, sitting alone at my kitchen table with the invoice squared neatly in front of me, that thorough and quiet and unconcerned with feelings sounded exactly like what an old man in my position actually needed. And I picked up the phone to call Des before I could talk myself into waiting even one more week. Ruth Ferris's office sat above a used bookstore on the east side of town. A single room reached by an exterior staircase that groaned under every step. And the sign on her door said nothing more than Ferris Investigations. No tagline, no decoration, nothing dressed up to look like more than it was. I liked that immediately. A person who does not need to dress up her sign usually does not need to dress up anything else either. She was somewhere in her late 40s, compact and unhurried, with a mechanical adding machine on the corner of her desk instead of a calculator, the kind with a hand crank and a paper roll. And I noticed her glance at it more than once during our conversation, as though she trusted its clean sums more than anything a phone could give her. I had called ahead. She was expecting me. "Mr. Redfern," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "Tell me what's going on." So I did. I talked for the better part of 40 minutes without interruption, laying out everything in the order I had come to understand it myself. The tremor everyone called arthritis, the blood test, the bottle Priya had started bringing 11 months ago, and the second one, higher potency, delivered just 3 weeks back. The 6 charges on the gallery's account, and the pharmacy invoice that had landed in my mailbox by accident, and the 2 ingredients no honest wellness formula had any business containing. Ruth wrote steadily through all of it on a yellow legal pad of her own, occasionally circling a word, occasionally drawing a small arrow between 2 items on the page. But she never once stopped me to ask a question or steer the story somewhere else. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me with the level, unhurried attention of someone who has heard a great many things and stopped being surprised by most of them. "The pharmacy account," she said. "It's in your son's name, or hers." "His," I told her. I checked before I called them. She nodded, writing something down. "And the gallery your son and daughter-in-law run. Any recent talk of expansion?" "Renovation. New space." I told her about Elena, about the buyer already lined up, about a name I had recognized from something much older. Aldo Reyes. Something shifted slightly in Ruth's expression at that name, subtle enough that a man not watching closely would have missed it entirely. "You said that name like it means something to you already," she said. 15 years ago, I told her there was a piece of county land that got rezoned, under paperwork that never quite added up. I never had proof of anything. I only had a feeling and 3 pieces of scrap steel I pulled off that site before the crew hauled the rest away, and a wife who told me to keep them because someday they might matter. Ruth set her pen down entirely and looked at me for a long moment. "Mr. Redfern," she said, "I'm going to need you to tell me everything you remember about that rezoning. Everything. Even the parts that seem like nothing." I told her what I remembered, which was less than I wanted it to be. 15 years having worn most of the sharp edges off my memory of it. A meeting I overheard by accident at the feed store. Two men discussing a parcel valuation that made no sense given the land's actual use. A name mentioned once quickly and never again in my presence. Rajiv, someone had said. Rajiv will handle the paperwork. Ruth wrote that down and underlined it twice. She asked me a handful of follow-up questions, precise ones, whether I remembered what time of year it had been, whether the two men at the feed store had noticed me overhearing, whether Marisol had ever mentioned the name Rajiv herself before she died. I told her no to the last one, though even as I said it, I found myself wondering whether that was entirely true, or whether it was simply the version of the story I had told myself long enough to believe. "Give me 3 weeks," she said, closing the folder in front of her with the finality of someone accustomed to knowing exactly how long these things took. "I'll start with the pharmacy records and the gallery's business filings. Public documents first, the parts nobody has to give me permission to see." I asked her what happened after 3 weeks, if she found what I was afraid she would find. "Then we talk about what you want to do with it," she said. "That part's always yours, Mr. Redfern, not mine." I thanked her and stood to leave, and she walked me to the door the way you walk out a client you suspect you'll be seeing again sooner than either of you would like. On the stairs down to the street, I passed a woman heading up carrying a box of files, and neither of us spoke, the particular silence of two strangers who had both, for their own private reasons, ended up needing the same kind of help. I drove home along the loop road that circled the edge of town, past the gallery district, and slowed without quite meaning to when Vane Gallery came into view. Its windows lit, even in the late afternoon. A new banner stretched across the front, announcing an expansion, opening in 6 weeks. I sat at the stop sign a beat longer than the intersection required, looking at that banner, and thought about 3 weeks and 6 weeks, and how little time that actually left me to understand what I was standing in the middle of. Ruth called 11 days into the 3 weeks she had asked for, which told me before she said a single word that whatever she had found had not waited politely for her original timeline. "Can you come in this afternoon?" she said. No pleasantries first, no easing into it. And I understood. Driving back to that office above the bookstore, that a woman who worked as carefully as Ruth Ferris did not rush unless rushing had become necessary. She had 2 folders open on her desk this time instead of 1, and she did not wait for me to sit before she started talking. "I found the wholesale supplier for the compounding pharmacy," she said. "The lead acetate and cadmium sulfate weren't sourced through a normal medical channel. They came through an industrial chemical distributor in El Paso, the kind that mostly serves metalworking and ceramics studios. Glazing compounds. Patina treatments for bronze and steel." I sat with that a moment, before I understood what she was telling me. A supplier a gallery would have legitimate reason to use. Priya's gallery had an active account with that distributor for 6 years, Ruth said. Ever since she and Nathaniel opened it. Small orders consistent with what a working gallery uses for finishing pieces. Nothing unusual there on its own. "Then what changed?" I asked her. Ruth turned the second folder toward me. "This did," she said, tapping a line she had highlighted in yellow. 12 months before your son's wedding, a new order appears on that account, larger than anything before it. Flagged for personal pickup rather than gallery delivery. Same chemical family, lead compounds, cadmium compounds, in quantities well beyond what any finishing process would call for. I stared at the date circled beside her finger and did the arithmetic slowly, the way you do arithmetic when you are afraid of what the answer will turn out to be. 12 months before the wedding. Nathaniel and Priya married 6 years ago. That put this order almost 7 years back, nearly 6 years before I ever swallowed a single capsule from that first bottle. "She started before they were even engaged," I said, and heard my own voice come out flatter than I expected. Flat, the way a man's voice goes when shock has not yet caught up to what he already understands intellectually. Ruth did not soften it. That's what the paperwork shows, she said. I can't tell you her intentions that far back. I can tell you the chemicals were acquired that early under her name through a business account she controlled personally before she and Nathaniel were officially partners in anything. I thought about the 8 months I had believed this had been happening. Then the 11 months the invoice suggested. Now this stretching back nearly 7 years, long enough that whatever had started in my kitchen with a small brown bottle had actually started somewhere else entirely. Years before Priya ever sat across from me at a family dinner. Years before I had any reason at all to watch her closely. I asked Ruth the only question that mattered to me in that moment. Does Nathaniel's name appear anywhere on that early order? She shook her head. Just hers. Whatever this was when it started before your son had anything to do with it at all. I don't know if that made it better or worse. I have turned that question over more times since than I can count, and I still don't have a clean answer. What I knew sitting in that office with the afternoon light slanting through the blinds was that the woman my son loved had been planning something involving me in some form for the better part of a decade. And that meant nothing about the last several years of Thursday visits and careful smiles had been improvised. Every gesture I had mistaken for warmth had been choreography, rehearsed long before I ever had reason to watch for the steps. Ruth gave me a moment before she spoke again. There's one more thing, she said, and I want you to hear it before you leave today. The Vein Gallery expansion. It's not fully funded through normal channels. There's a private loan behind it, and the collateral listed is unusual for a business loan this size. What's the collateral? I asked, though some cold, steady part of me had already guessed the answer before she said it. Future acquisition of adjacent commercial property. Ruth read from the paperwork, her voice level and precise. Currently held by A. Redfern. She looked up at me over the top of her reading glasses. The lender wouldn't normally accept that kind of language. Land somebody doesn't yet own listed as collateral, unless they had reason to believe the acquisition was close to certain. Somebody made a convincing case to that lender that this property was going to change hands. I asked her who the lender was. A regional commercial bank out of Alpine, she said. Nothing exotic. Loan officer's name is on the paperwork, along with a note that the application was expedited at the request of an existing client relationship. She turned the page toward me so I could see it myself. The existing client was Aldo Reyes. I sat with that for a moment, watching the pieces settle into a shape I had been circling for weeks without quite seeing whole. Aldo, who had lived in this town longer than Priya had been alive. Aldo, whose name Elena had repeated back to me without understanding what she was handing me. Aldo, who apparently carried enough weight with a commercial lender to get a loan expedited on the strength of land he did not own, and I had never once offered to sell. I sat in that office a long time after she finished looking at the banner I had seen through my truck window less than 2 weeks earlier, no longer just an announcement of an opening date, but a debt already leveraged against land I had not agreed to sell, structured by people confident enough in their own timeline that they had put real money behind an outcome they had not yet forced into being. I did not go home right away. I drove out past the edge of town, on the loop road past the last gallery and the first cattle guard, until the pavement gave out and the road turned to caliche dust under the truck's tires. And I sat there a long while, with the engine off, looking at nothing in particular. The flat scrub stretching toward the Chinati Mountains in the last of the daylight. The way a man looks at nothing when he needs somewhere to put his eyes while his mind works through something too large to face directly. 7 years. I kept returning to that number, the way you return to a sore tooth, with your tongue unable to leave it alone, even though touching it hurt every single time. 7 years meant Priya had walked into an art fair in Marathon already carrying whatever this was, already knowing in some form I could not yet fully picture that a man named Augustus Redfern existed, owned land she wanted and possessed information about a 15-year-old rezoning that could unravel something belonging to her family. I called Des that evening, not because I had a plan yet, but because some things a man cannot carry alone through a single night. And Des had earned, across 35 years of friendship, the right to be asked. He came over within the hour, thermos in one hand, still in his work clothes, a smear of grease along one forearm from whatever he'd been fixing when I called, and sat across from me at the kitchen table, without bothering to wash up first, the way a man does when he understands the conversation ahead matters more than appearances. While I laid it out the way Ruth had laid it out for me. The chemicals, the 7 years, the loan built on land I had never agreed to sell. Des did not say much while I talked. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug the way he always did when something needed thinking through rather than reacting to. And when I finished, he was quiet long enough that I started to wonder if he'd heard all of it. He set the mug down, finally, turned it a quarter turn on the table without seeming to notice he was doing it, a habit I had watched him repeat at this same table for 3.5 decades whenever a subject required more care than his first instinct wanted to give it. 7 years, he finally said, is not an accident at all, Gus. That's not a woman who fell into something by chance. That's a woman who built something brick by brick and married your son on the way to building it. I told him I had already worked that much out for myself. He looked at me steadily across the table, the particular look of a man who has known you long enough to say a hard thing without softening it first. Does Nathaniel know? He asked. Any part of this? I told him what Ruth had told me, that the early chemical order carried only Priya's name, that whatever had started 7 years ago had started without my son's knowledge, as far as the paper trail showed. But I told Des, too, that I no longer trusted my own certainty about anything involving Nathaniel. Not after watching him hand me a bottle every single morning for 8 months, with nothing but warmth on his face. A man can be innocent of starting something, and still guilty of not asking enough questions once it was already moving, Des said. And I sat with that sentence a long time after he said it, because I recognized it as true, and because I understood hearing it out loud that it applied just as easily to me as it did to my son. I had not asked enough questions either. Not about the bottle, not about Priya's Thursday visits, not about a rezoning 15 years ago that I had let slide into silence because confrontation had never come naturally to me. Not even when confrontation was exactly what the moment required. We sat a long while after that, without talking the way two old friends can sit without needing to fill every silence with something. The kitchen clock above the stove ticked through several minutes neither of us bothered to count. Des asked eventually what I intended to do once Ruth finished her 3 weeks, and I told him honestly that I did not know yet. Only that whatever I decided, I wanted it done in a way that gave them no room to explain it away afterward as confusion or misunderstanding. He nodded slowly at that, the nod of a man who understood exactly what kind of proof I was describing, and told me, before he stood to leave, that whatever I decided, he intended to be standing beside me when it happened. Des left close to midnight that night, telling me to call him the second Ruth found anything more, and I sat alone in my kitchen after his truck pulled away, the house settling into the particular silence it kept these days, quieter than it had been since Marisol died, quieter somehow than even that grief had left it. My phone rang again 2 mornings later, before I had finished my first cup of coffee. Ruth's name lighting up the screen, and something in the timing told me this call would not be a small one either. I want you to understand her voice in that ledger, because it changed how I heard every warm thing she had ever said to me since. Ruth had found a document that stripped Priya's kindness down to its actual mechanics, and once I read it, I could never again mistake the mechanics for the kindness itself. I sat down before Ruth said a word this time, because I had learned enough by now to know when a room was about to change shape around me. She slid a single printed page across the desk, a spreadsheet with columns I did not immediately understand, dates running down the left side, dosage measurements running across the top. Small, handwritten notes crowded into the margins, in handwriting Ruth confirmed after cross-referencing it against gallery invoices, belonged to Priya. This was recovered from a cloud storage account linked to the gallery's business email, Ruth said. My source accessed it through a subpoena request tied to a separate financial inquiry she's already under for the loan structure. It wasn't supposed to exist anymore. She deleted the original file 11 months ago. This is a cached version that survived. I looked at the columns more carefully. Dates stretching back nearly 7 years, thin and sparse at first, then thickening, then organizing themselves into a rhythm I recognized instantly because I had spent 40 years reading columns exactly like it, tracking exactly this kind of pattern. Except the thing being tracked in every version of my own work had been steel, and the thing being tracked here was me. Read the notes column, Ruth said quietly. 3rd quarter, 4 years back. I read it. Subject shows no cognitive impact at current dosage. Motor function decline consistent with target timeline. Continue current formulation through completion of pieces. Completion of pieces, I said out loud, and heard my own voice come out strange, distant. A man hearing his own name mispronounced by someone he'd trusted with it. Ruth did not look away from me while she explained it, and I have come to understand since that she did that on purpose. The way a doctor holds eye contact while delivering something a patient needs to hear, without flinching first. She wasn't trying to kill you, Mr. Redfern. The dosages were calibrated specifically to avoid lethal accumulation. What she was targeting was fine motor control. Enough to prevent detailed work. Not enough to raise alarm. Not enough to be obviously connected to any single symptom a doctor would flag as unusual on its own. I asked her the question I had been circling for weeks, without letting myself say the whole shape of it. She didn't want me dead. She wanted my hands stopped. Specifically, Ruth said she wanted 3 particular pieces never finished. There's a note here, 4 different entries across 2 years, referencing what she calls the courthouse pieces. I don't know yet exactly what that means to you, but I suspect you do, I told her. I told her everything Marisol and I had never spoken of to anyone else. The scrap steel pulled from that rezoned lot 15 years ago. The 3 sculptures built around it, sketched by a woman who somehow understood before either of us fully did, that those 3 pieces would someday matter more than any ironwork I had ever made. I told her that only I knew how to read what was hidden inside them, a language of seams and welds and deliberately misaligned joints that meant nothing to anyone who had not spent 40 years learning to hear metal the way other men learned to hear music. Ruth listened, without writing anything down this time, which told me she already understood the shape of what I was describing before I finished describing it. If those pieces stayed unfinished forever, she said slowly, whatever they contain stays hidden forever too. Nobody has to steal them. Nobody has to destroy them. They just have to sit in a corner of your shop, incomplete, for the rest of your life. I sat in that chair a long time after she said it, feeling something settle into place that was worse somehow than anger, worse than grief. A kind of cold clarity I had not felt since the morning Dr. Hale first said the word poisoning out loud. My hands had not been failing me. They had been stopped deliberately, patiently, by someone who understood exactly what those hands were capable of finishing, and exactly what finishing them would cost her family. I am 70 years old, I said to Ruth, and I do not know if my voice broke saying it or simply went very quiet. I have spent my whole life believing patience was a virtue. She used my own patience against me for 7 years, and I never once saw the shape of what she was building until it was already standing over me, fully formed, waiting only for those 3 sculptures to remain unfinished long enough that the question of finishing them would simply stop being asked by anyone at all, including, eventually, me. Ruth let that sit in the room a moment before she answered. Then start using it against her instead, she said. You have time now that she doesn't know you have. Use it the way you'd use anything else you understand better than the person across from you. She closed the folder on her desk, squared its edges with both hands the way a woman closes something she does not intend to reopen carelessly, and told me that whatever I decided to do next, she would help me build a case solid enough that no lawyer, no family narrative about a confused old man, and no amount of practiced warmth could talk it back into doubt once it stood in front of people who mattered. I drove home that afternoon with the printed spreadsheet folded in my jacket pocket. And for the first time since Dr. Hale's office, I did not feel afraid of what I was carrying. I felt something colder and steadier settling into its place instead. The particular stillness of a man who has finally stopped asking why and started asking, what happens next? I did not sleep that night. Instead, close to midnight, I found myself standing in the hallway outside the small room that had been Marisol's studio. My hand resting on a doorknob I had not turned in longer than I wanted to admit. The room still smelled faintly of turpentine 22 years on, a smell the house had never quite let go of, no matter how many times I aired it out. Her easel stood folded against the far wall, exactly where she had left it the last week she was strong enough to climb the stairs on her own. Her brushes sat in a coffee can on the windowsill, bristles long since gone stiff and useless, and I had never once been able to throw them away. On the shelf above her old drafting table sat a wooden box. Oak, the same wood I had used for the courthouse shelving all those years ago, built by my own hands as a wedding gift the year we married. I remembered building it in the winter before our wedding, staying up past midnight in my father's shed to finish the dovetail joints properly, wanting it to be something that would outlast both of us. Marisol had cried when I gave it to her, not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because she told me later she could see exactly how many hours of care had gone into every corner of it. And she said that was the moment she understood what kind of husband I intended to be. I had opened that box exactly twice since she died. Once the week after the funeral, to find something appropriate to bury her in a scarf she had loved. Once, 11 years ago, to find a photograph Nathaniel wanted for a school project. Both times I had seen the envelope sitting near the bottom, my name written across the front in her forward slanting cursive. And both times I had closed the lid without touching it, telling myself there would be a better time, a calmer time, a time when I would be ready to hear whatever she had left for me to hear. I want you to understand what it means to look at something every single day. Or in this case, to know it is sitting 15 feet from where you sleep every single night. And choose for 22 years not to open it. It was not exactly avoidance. It was closer to preservation. As long as I had not read whatever she had written, some part of the conversation between us remained unfinished, still possible, still ongoing, in a way that closing it would have ended for good. Tonight, standing there with a spreadsheet full of dosages folded in my jacket pocket and 3 unfinished sculptures waiting in my workshop, I understood that unfinished conversation had already ended, whether I acknowledged it or not. Priya had made sure of that in her own way, years before I had any reason to suspect her intentions. If she had spent 7 years working to keep something of Marisol's permanently incomplete, I owed it to both of us to finally finish what I could. I lifted the box down and carried it to the kitchen table, setting it in the exact spot where I had once spread out bank statements and receipts and pharmacy invoices. The same table where I had done every piece of careful, frightened arithmetic of the past several weeks. I opened the lid. Inside, everything sat exactly as I remembered it. recipes clipped from magazines decades out of print, a lock of Nathaniel's hair from his first haircut tied with a ribbon that had faded from blue to nearly white. Birthday cards from people who were gone now, their handwriting the only piece of them left in this house. And beneath all of it, a leather sketchbook I recognized instantly. The one she had carried into the workshop nearly every day of our marriage. The one that had gone quiet on a shelf the year she got too sick to hold a pencil steady. I lifted it out with both hands, feeling the weight of it. The particular fragility of something that has waited a long time to be opened again. The envelope with my name on it sat beneath where the sketchbook had rested. Still there. Still waiting. I set the envelope aside for the moment. I opened the sketchbook first. The early pages held sketches I remembered clearly. Gates and railings and courtyard pieces we had built together over decades. Her handwriting cramped along the margins with notes about proportion and weight that I had followed without ever fully understanding how she saw the finished shape so far ahead of me. Then I reached the pages near the back, the ones I had not looked at closely in 22 years, and found the 3 courthouse sketches exactly as I remembered them. Witness and its 2 companion pieces, drawn in the confident, unhurried lines of a woman who had known even then precisely what she was asking the steel to become. Beside the 3rd sketch in the margin, in handwriting slightly smaller and more careful than the rest, as though she had wanted to make certain it would still be legible whenever I finally found it, she had written something I had never seen before. A single line, dated the same month she got her diagnosis, 3 years before the end. If you are reading this, and the 3rd piece is still unfinished, something has gone wrong. Trust yourself to see it. You always see the flaw in the metal before you see it in the people who love you. I sat at that table a long time with the sketchbook open in front of me, my hands trembling slightly. Not from the tremor this time, but from something that had nowhere else to go. I did not open the envelope right away. I sat with it in my hands for a long while, turning it over twice, feeling the particular weight of 2 pages folded inside. The way you feel the weight of something before you understand what it will cost you to read it. "Come on, Gus," I said out loud, to the empty kitchen, to the house settling around me the way it did every night now, and finally slid my finger under the flap. 2 pages both sides filled her handwriting, small enough to fit as much as she could onto the paper. I won't tell you every word of it. Some of what she wrote belongs only to me, the way certain things between a husband and wife are meant to stay between them, even after one of them is gone. But I will tell you what mattered most, because it changed the shape of everything that came after. She wrote about the forge, about watching me work through the lean years back when a single missed order could mean choosing between the mortgage and the light bill. And I never once let her see how frightened I was during any of it. She wrote that watching me refuse to quit was the thing she admired most about me. And also, she added, the thing that occasionally made her want to throw something at my head. That line made me laugh out loud, alone at my kitchen table, at nearly 1 in the morning. My eyes stinging badly enough that I had to stop reading for a moment. Then she wrote the paragraph I had been circling my entire life, without knowing it was waiting for me. "Gus, I know you trust too easily. I have watched you your whole life extend people more patience than they have earned, long past the point any sensible man would have stopped. It is one of the things I love most about you, and it is the thing I have worried about most every single year we've been married. If there ever comes a day when you don't know who to trust anymore, trust yourself first. You have always seen the truth in things before you let yourself believe it. Don't wait as long as you usually do." I read that paragraph 4 times. I sat at the table with her letter in both hands until the clock above the stove read past 2 in the morning. The house completely silent around me, the oak beam creaking once somewhere overhead, the way old houses do when the temperature drops. I set the letter down on the table for a moment and simply sat. The refrigerator cycled on its low hum, filling the kitchen the way it had every night for 36 years. Outside the window, the wind moved through the mesquite along the fence line. A dry, papery sound I had heard so many times it had long since stopped registering as sound at all. A moth batted twice against the porch light and went still. I did not move. I did not reach for the letter again. Yet. I only sat there, in the particular stillness that comes after something too large has finally been said out loud. Letting the kitchen hold me, the way it had held me through every other night that mattered in this house. I want to tell you something now that I have never said out loud to anyone. Not to Des, not to Ruth, not even until this moment, to myself. In words I was willing to fully hear. Somewhere underneath everything I have told you so far, some old and quiet part of me had sensed something was not right about Priya. From very nearly the beginning. Some small wrongness in the timing of her warmth, in how precisely it always arrived, exactly when I needed it most. I had felt it the way you feel a hairline crack in a weld before you can see it. A faint resistance under the hammer that tells you something. And I had chosen every single time to believe the smile instead of the crack. Because believing the smile was so much easier than doubting the woman my son had chosen to love. And because a man who has spent his whole life trusting people does not enjoy discovering how much of that trust was simply the path of least resistance, wearing a kinder name. I folded the letter carefully, the way you fold something you intend to keep for the rest of your life, and tucked it into my shirt pocket, close against my chest. Okay, Marisol, I said quietly to the kitchen, to the oak tree outside the window. I couldn't see in the dark, to the woman who had known me better than I had ever fully known myself. I hear you. I sat there a while longer without moving. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard settled with a small, familiar creak I had heard 10,000 nights and never once needed to notice before tonight. I did not cry. I only sat, letting the quiet close around me, the way it does after something enormous has finally finished happening. When I finally stood and turned off the kitchen light, I had already decided what I was not going to do. I was not going to call Nathaniel in the morning and confront him with what Ruth had found. I was not going to drive to the gallery and demand Priya explain 7 years of dosage notes to my face. Marisol's letter had told me to trust myself, and what I trusted sitting alone in the dark was that a confrontation now, before I understood the entire shape of what I was standing inside of, would only hand them the chance to close ranks and explain it all away. I decided climbing the stairs to bed that night that I would act, but quietly, on my own schedule, in my own way. And I would not tell a single soul outside this house what I intended until the moment it was already too late for anyone to stop me. I started the following week, once I had settled the plan clearly enough in my own mind not to second-guess it every time my hands trembled with something other than nerves. I chose Tuesday and Thursday nights first, the 2 evenings I could count on neither Nathaniel nor Priya stopping by unannounced, and built the rest of my schedule around watching their patterns closely enough to know exactly when the workshop would be mine alone. By day, I remained exactly the man Priya and Nathaniel believed they had built. I let the tremor show whenever they were near. I leaned on the cane Des had loaned me years ago after his knee surgery, propped now by my front door for exactly this purpose. I forgot small things on purpose. Misplaced my reading glasses in front of Nathaniel twice in 1 week. Blinked at Priya with genuine-looking confusion when she asked about a doctor's appointment I remembered perfectly well. The inconsistency was intentional. A confused old man forgets he needs the cane sometimes. That was the impression I wanted them carrying home with them. By night, once their trucks had pulled out of my driveway and the house had settled into its familiar quiet, I walked out to the workshop, locked the door behind me, and lit the forge. The first night, my hands shook so badly lighting the burner that I nearly gave up before I started. 10 days off the real bottle had given me back small motions, a chisel held steady, a hand file drawn cleanly across scrap steel. It had not yet given me back the confidence a man needs to trust his grip around a hammer swung with real force near a fire hot enough to soften iron. I stood there a long while, palms flat against the cold anvil, breathing the way I used to breathe before every difficult weld of my working life. And then I picked the hammer up anyway. The first strikes were clumsy. I ruined a scrap piece testing my own control before I trusted myself anywhere near the courthouse sculptures themselves. But by the third night, something in my wrist remembered what 40 years had taught it. Tremor and poison notwithstanding, and I struck 4 clean blows in a row for the first time since before any of this began. By the 7th night, I had reopened the seam on witness that had defeated me weeks earlier, working it slowly under low light, so the sound of the hammer wouldn't carry past the workshop walls. Pausing every few minutes to listen for headlights on the road that never came. I kept the mason jar hidden behind the tools on the high shelf, refilling the bottle on my kitchen counter with fresh calcium tablets every few weeks. Careful to match the pill count so nothing looked disturbed if anyone ever checked. I logged my progress on the same yellow legal pad, dates and durations, the way I had once logged inventory counts, until the pattern of my own recovery became as clear to me as any ledger Ruth had ever shown me. 11 nights in. I could hold a punch steady long enough to drive a clean hole through half-inch stock, something I had not managed since before the tremor first appeared, back when everyone, myself included, still believed it was simply age catching up with me. Des found me on the 11th night. He had come by to return a borrowed drill, seen light bleeding out from under the workshop door well past midnight, and let himself in through the side gate, the way he had for 35 years, not bothering to knock first, because between the two of us, knocking had stopped meaning anything decades ago. He stood in the doorway a long moment, watching me work a glowing seam on the second courthouse piece, before he said a single word. "Gus," he said, "your hands." I set the hammer down and told him everything. The mason jar, the calcium tablets, 11 nights of quiet, careful practice while I performed decline for anyone watching in daylight. Des listened without interrupting, the same way he had listened to everything else I'd told him over the past several weeks. And when I finished, he walked slowly around the workshop, looking at the 2 pieces I had already made real progress on, running one finger lightly along a seam I had reopened that same evening. "You're finishing them," he said. "Not just fixing your hands, finishing them, for real." I told him that was exactly what I intended to do. "What happens when they're done?" he asked. I did not have a complete answer yet, not that night. What I told him was the truth as far as it went. That I intended to let the world see all 3 pieces at once, in a setting Priya herself would be unable to avoid or explain away, and that I needed the sculptures finished before I could decide anything else with any precision. Des nodded slowly, the nod of a man deciding something important without needing to say it out loud yet, and told me he would keep his mouth shut and his eyes open, and that whatever nights I needed him standing watch outside so nobody wandered up unannounced, he would be there. He left near 2 in the morning, and I worked another hour after that until my hands finally trembled with fatigue rather than poison. And even that felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like something I had earned honestly. I banked the forge the way my father had taught me, buried the coals just deep enough to hold their heat until morning, and stood a moment in the doorway, looking back at the 2 shrouded shapes standing closer to finished than they had been in 22 years, before I finally locked up and walked back to the house under a sky full of more stars than a man in a city ever gets to see. Ruth called again 10 days later, and this time her voice on the phone carried a different weight than the urgency of the earlier calls. Something closer to the careful tone of a woman about to hand a man information he had been avoiding his whole life, without quite admitting it to himself. "I found your rezoning," she said when I sat down across from her desk. 15 years back, the county land you mentioned. I know exactly what happened to it now, and I know who made it happen. She opened a folder considerably thicker than the ones she'd shown me before county records and old newspaper clippings, and a formal complaint that had apparently gone nowhere. Filed and quietly buried within 8 months of being submitted. The parcel was rezoned from agricultural to mixed commercial use through an expedited variance, she said, sliding a document toward me. The variance required sign-off from 3 members of the County Planning Commission. 2 of them are dead now. The third one is a man named Rajiv Ansari. I sat with that name a moment, feeling it land somewhere I had known on some level it eventually would. Priya's father, I said. Ruth nodded. He served on that commission for 11 years before retiring. During his tenure, he approved 4 variances that later drew formal complaints for irregular process. 3 were dismissed for lack of standing. The 4th, yours, was withdrawn entirely, and Ruth turned another page toward me. The withdrawal was filed the same week your original complainant's small business lost its county contract for road maintenance work. I understood what she was telling me without needing her to spell it out further. Somebody had leaned on the one man brave enough to formally object, and that man had folded quickly the way most men fold when their livelihood is placed on the scale against a principle. Who was he? I asked. The one who complained. A contractor named Ezekiel Voss, Ruth said. He passed away 6 years ago. Natural causes as far as I could confirm. His daughter still lives in Alpine. I haven't reached out to her yet. I wanted to bring this to you first, in case there's something you'd rather I handle differently, given everything else already sitting on your plate. I thought about that contractor, a man I had never met, standing up 15 years ago and saying out loud what I had only ever whispered privately to Marisol, and paying for it with his business, while I said nothing at all, and kept 3 pieces of scrap steel instead of a single word of testimony. The comparison sat uncomfortably in my chest, and I let it sit there, rather than push it away. Because I had learned over these past several months that the discomfort usually meant I was finally looking at something true. I asked Ruth to reach out to the daughter eventually, once the timing made sense, and to tell her when she did that her father had not been wrong, and that somebody had finally been listening. There's more, Ruth said, and her voice shifted slightly. The tone she used when she was about to hand me something that would cost me more than the facts alone justified. Rajiv Ansari's financial records show a payment 18 months after the rezoning cleared. $200,000 routed through a shell entity that dissolved within a year of receiving it. I can't prove definitively who paid it, but the timing and the amount line up closely with property values on that parcel at the time. I asked her the question that had been building under everything else since the moment she said Priya's father's name. Did Priya know? Growing up, did she understand what her father had done? Ruth was quiet a moment, the particular quiet of someone choosing her words with more care than usual. I can't answer that with certainty, she said. What I can tell you is that Priya was 23 when the complaint was filed and withdrawn. Old enough to have understood if anyone in that household discussed it openly. Old enough that if she learned about it later as an adult, she would have understood exactly what kind of exposure your 3 sculptures represented to her family's name and to whatever inheritance came with it. I sat in that office a long time, turning over a version of the story I had not let myself consider until Ruth laid it out so plainly. Priya had not simply married into a family and later stumbled onto a dangerous secret. If Ruth's timeline held, Priya had potentially known or come to know exactly what her father had done, and had married my son with that knowledge already sitting somewhere inside her, waiting for an opportunity to protect what 15 years of silence had allowed her family to keep. I thought about the wedding photographs still hanging in Nathaniel's apartment, Priya laughing beside my son under string lights, and wondered how much of that laughter had already been calculating something entirely different from what it appeared to be celebrating. Ruth closed the folder gently and looked at me across the desk with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, something closer to genuine sympathy than her usual professional neutrality allowed. "I know this is a lot to carry at once," she said. "You don't have to decide anything about how to use it today." I told her I understood that, though sitting there, I already suspected I would spend every night between now and whatever came next turning these new facts over the same way I turned over a piece of steel before deciding exactly where to strike it. "I love you the way a father is supposed to love a son." I thought driving home that evening, the phrase arriving unbidden and only half-formed. And I did not yet know whether I was thinking it about Nathaniel or about myself, standing in the doorway of a truth I had spent 15 years too patient, too quiet, too willing to wait to walk all the way into. I spent the better part of a week turning one question over, without finding a shape for it that satisfied me. If Priya had married my son already carrying her father's secret, already understanding what my silence had protected all those years, did that mean everything about her marriage to Nathaniel had been calculated from the very beginning? Or had genuine feeling simply grown up alongside a plan that started as something colder, the way a wildflower can take root in soil that was never meant to grow anything at all? I did not have a clean answer. I still don't entirely. And I have made a kind of peace with not having one. What I had instead were small memories I found myself revisiting with a different eye now. Priya at their wedding, crying during Nathaniel's vows. Tears I had assumed at the time were simple happiness. Priya in the hospital waiting room the year Nathaniel had his appendix removed, holding his hand through 6 hours of nothing, refusing to leave, even to eat, snapping once at a nurse who suggested she go get coffee, her voice sharp with a fear that had seemed at the time entirely uncomplicated. Priya watching him across a dinner table, with an expression I had always read as tenderness, and now could not entirely unread, no matter how hard I tried. I remembered, too, a smaller moment I had nearly forgotten until it surfaced that week, unbidden. 2 years into their marriage, Priya had mentioned once, almost offhandedly, that her father had been sick that winter. Some vague reference to his heart, and that she'd flown to see him for a week, without explaining much beyond that. Nathaniel had been worried about her the whole time she was gone, calling me twice to ask if I thought she was really all right. I had told him families carry things privately sometimes, and left it at that. I wondered now, turning the memory over, whether that trip had been about her father's heart at all, or about something closer to strategy. A conversation about timelines and courthouse pieces, conducted somewhere I would never have thought to look. I called Des one evening and asked him the question directly, because I trusted his judgment on people more than my own just then. My own having proven itself capable of missing quite a lot. "Can a person truly love someone and still be capable of what she's done to me?" I asked him directly. Des thought about it a long while before he answered, the way he thought about anything that deserved real consideration, rather than a quick response meant to make me feel better, turning his coffee mug a quarter turn, the way he always did when a question required more than instinct. "I think a person can convince themselves of almost anything, Gus," he finally said. "I think she might love him completely, and still have decided a long time ago that loving him didn't cancel out whatever she believed she owed her father, or herself, or whatever story she's telling herself about why any of this was necessary. Those two things aren't as far apart in most people as we'd like to believe." I sat with that answer much longer than I expected to. It didn't make anything easier. It made the whole situation harder, in fact. Because a woman who loved my son, and had still done this to me, was a far more complicated enemy than a woman who felt nothing at all. Nothing would have been simple. Nothing would have let me hate her cleanly, without the small, persistent ache of understanding that grief and greed really can occupy the same person, without either one canceling the other out. I thought about Nathaniel differently after that conversation, too. I had spent weeks assuming, without quite admitting I was assuming it, that he had to be either fully innocent or fully complicit, one or the other. A clean division that would tell me exactly how much of my anger belonged to him and how much belonged only to her. Dez's answer took that clean division away from me. If Priya could hold love and deception together without contradiction, then perhaps Nathaniel could hold something similarly complicated. Perhaps he genuinely believed the bottle he handed me every morning was medicine. And perhaps some quieter, more cowardly part of him had also chosen the way I had chosen for 15 years, not to ask the harder questions that might have unraveled a comfortable life he had no real desire to examine too closely. I remembered him mentioning once in passing that Priya handled most of the household's financial planning, that she was better with numbers than he was, that he trusted her judgment on things like that, the way I had once trusted mine to a shop full of tools. I understood completely. I did not excuse him for that sitting alone in my kitchen that night. But I understood it in the way you understand a flaw in a weld once you know exactly what pressure caused it. And understanding it made the anger sharper in some ways, and strangely quieter in others. The difference between rage at a stranger and grief at watching someone you love fail a test you had in your own way failed as well 15 years earlier, when a different kind of silence had let a different kind of wrong go unanswered. I went out to the workshop that night, earlier than usual, needing my hands busy on something honest and physical, while my mind worked through everything else. And found myself standing longest, not at either of the two pieces already well underway, but at the third, the one I had not yet dared to touch, the one Marisol's sketch called simply the ledger. Its shrouded shape sitting in the corner like a question I had spent 15 years too afraid to finish asking out loud. I touched the ledger for the first time in 3 weeks, on a night close enough to finishing the other two pieces that I could feel the shape of an ending approaching. The particular gravity a project takes on in its final stretch, when every choice starts to matter more, because there is so much less room left to correct it. Marisol's sketch for this third piece was the most demanding of the three. A spiraling column of steel meant to fold back on itself twice before opening outward. And I understood, working the first heated section under the hammer, why I had avoided it longest. It required a steadiness the other two had not, a sustained precision across dozens of consecutive strikes, rather than the shorter bursts the first two pieces demanded. It was, in its way, a test of exactly how much my hands had actually recovered. Not just enough for scattered clean strikes, but enough for real sustained work. The first fold fought me for 2 full hours before I found the right heat, the right angle, the particular patience the steel demanded, before it would agree to bend the way Marisol had drawn it decades earlier. I ruined one length of stock entirely, overheating it past the point where it would hold a clean shape, and set it aside without the frustration I might have felt months ago, because failure in the workshop had never once cost me anything, the way silence outside it had. I worked on it 3 nights straight, Des standing watch outside on 2 of them, and by the third night I had shaped the first fold cleanly enough that I allowed myself, for the first time since this whole ordeal began, something close to confidence that I would actually finish all 3 pieces before whatever came next arrived. My forearms ached in the way they used to ache after a full day at the forge decades ago. A good ache. The kind that told me a body was finally being asked to do the work it remembered how to do. Des came to find me on that third night, carrying something other than his usual thermos. A folded piece of paper he set on the workbench without a word. "What's this?" I asked him, setting down the hammer. "Marfa Independent," he said. "Ran a small piece today about the Vane Gallery expansion opening. I read it twice because something in it didn't sit right, and then I understood why." I unfolded the paper and read it myself. The article described the opening as originally planned for gallery patrons and select collectors only, an intimate evening befitting the caliber of work being introduced. Then, near the bottom, a single line, noting the event had recently been expanded to a full community celebration. Open invitation, timed to coincide with the town's autumn arts weekend. I don't understand, I told Des. Why change it? Des leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. The particular stillness he got when he'd already worked something through and was waiting to see if I'd arrive at it myself. Think about it from her side, he said. As far as she knows, you're barely holding a coffee cup steady most days. You're forgetful. You lean on a cane half the time and forget it the other half. She spent months building a story around town that you can't be trusted with your own affairs anymore. I started to see where he was heading. A woman that confident, he continued, doesn't worry about an old man with shaking hands showing up to her big public moment. If anything, having half the town see how diminished you've become only helps the story she's already telling. Making it bigger isn't a risk to her, it's an opportunity. She has no idea what she's actually inviting into that room. I sat down slowly on the stool beside the anvil, feeling the shape of it settle into place the way a good joint settles once you've finally found the right angle to drive it home. I had been turning over quieter approaches for weeks. A private meeting with an attorney, perhaps, or a smaller confrontation, arranged carefully between family. Only something contained and controlled. Standing there with that newspaper clipping in my hand, I understood I had been thinking too small, still operating from the old instinct that had cost me 15 years of silence about a rezoning. Nobody else had the courage to challenge, either. Ezekiel Voss had complained quietly through proper channels and been crushed for it, before anyone outside his own family ever knew he'd tried. I thought about his daughter in Alpine, still living with whatever her father's quiet failure had cost their family. And I understood, sitting in my own workshop with two nearly finished sculptures behind me, that quiet had never once protected anyone in this story. It had only ever bought time for the people doing the harming. I was not going to make that same mistake twice. Des watched me work through it, patiently the way he always was, when he could see a decision taking shape in someone before they'd found the words for it yet. "You've got that look," he finally said. "The one you get right before you decide something you're not going to walk back from." If Priya wanted an audience, I told him, setting the newspaper down carefully on the bench, I intended to give her a considerably larger one than she was expecting. And every single person in that room was going to hear the truth at the same moment, with no time for anyone to shape it into something smaller before it had a chance to land. No private conversation afterward where she could soften the edges or explain it away as an old man's confusion. Des nodded slowly, the particular nod of a man who had just been asked, without either of us saying it directly, to stand beside me when it happened. "Then we'd better make sure those last two pieces are finished in time," he said, and picked the hammer back up off the bench, handing it to me the way you hand a man a tool he still has every right to be trusted with. The Vane Gallery expansion opened on the second Saturday of October, under string lights, strung across a courtyard that had, until 18 months ago, been an empty lot Priya had quietly acquired through a shell purchase Ruth had traced back to her 3 weeks earlier. I arrived at 7, deliberately early enough to seem eager rather than calculating, leaning on my cane, wearing the same tremor I had been wearing for months now. Practiced enough that I no longer had to think about maintaining it. Des arrived separately, 20 minutes later, the way we'd planned, positioning himself near the courtyard's side entrance, where he could see the crowd without appearing to watch anyone in particular. The 3 courthouse pieces sat under canvas in the bed of my truck parked 2 blocks away on a side street, exactly where Des and I had left them the night before, after loading them under cover of darkness. Nobody at the gallery knew they existed yet, let alone that they were finished, let alone that they were close enough to reach the courtyard within minutes if the moment called for it. The crowd built steadily through the evening. Regional collectors I recognized from decades of selling ironwork to their houses. Gallery patrons from Marathon and Alpine, and as far as El Paso. A reporter from the Marfa Independent, notebook in hand, working the room for quotes about the expansion. Half the town, it seemed, had turned out for the free wine and the chance to see what Priya had built. And I moved through all of it slowly, accepting the small courtesies people extend to an old man they believe is failing, letting them underestimate exactly how closely I was watching everything. Mrs. Delgado from the feed store stopped me near the entrance to ask how I was holding up these days, her voice carrying the particular gentle concern people had started using with me over the past several months. I told her I was managing and thanked her for asking, and watched her nod with the satisfied sympathy of someone confirming a story she'd already heard from somebody else. I understood standing there, accepting her kindness, exactly how far Priya's version of me had traveled through this town, one careful conversation at a time, until an old man's ordinary tiredness had become, in the retelling, something closer to decline. Elena found me near the hors d'oeuvres table, Ember tucked into a small carrier bag Nathaniel had apparently agreed to let her bring, and told me at considerable length about a deep-sea documentary she'd watched twice that week. I let her talk, grateful for a few minutes of something entirely uncomplicated, crouching down to her eye level the way I always did, and felt, not for the first time that evening, the particular ache of loving a child caught in the middle of something she had no way of understanding yet. Nathaniel found me near the main pavilion around 8, dressed sharper than I'd seen him in months, genuine pride in his face as he gestured at the crowd. "Pretty incredible turnout, Dad," he said, squeezing my shoulder the way he always had. "Glad you could make it out tonight." I told him I wouldn't have missed it, which was, in its own way, entirely true. Priya found me 20 minutes after that, moving through the courtyard with the particular ease of a woman standing at the center of something she had spent years building. A glass of wine in one hand, greeting patrons by name, directing caterers with small, precise gestures that never once broke the warmth of her expression toward the guests around her. She kissed my cheek when she reached me, told me how wonderful it was that I'd come, asked with practiced concern whether I needed to sit down anywhere quieter. "I'm fine right here, sweetheart," I told her, and watched something pass behind her eyes. I had come to recognize clearly by now the particular satisfaction of a woman checking a box she'd expected to need to work harder to check. I found Ruth near the back of the courtyard, close to 9, standing near the catering tables in a plain dark coat, nursing a glass of water rather than wine, exactly where we had agreed she would position herself. She caught my eye once, briefly, and gave the smallest possible nod, confirmation that everything on her end was ready. The documents, the timeline, the case built carefully enough over these past months that nothing tonight would depend on improvisation. Beside her, unobtrusive in the crowd, stood a man I recognized from a photograph Ruth had shown me weeks earlier. A plainclothes detective from the county sheriff's office. She had spent considerable effort persuading to attend quietly on the strength of everything we had already handed the prosecutor's office. I checked my watch. 9:15. The crowd had grown thick enough now that the courtyard felt genuinely full. Easily 200 people spread across the lit space. Conversation and laughter rising in the particular hum of a party reaching its peak, before it either continues climbing or begins slowly to wind down. Somewhere near the pavilion, a string quartet Priya had hired for the evening worked through something classical and unhurried, entirely unaware of what the next hour intended to do to the mood they were so carefully setting. I found Dez's eyes across the courtyard. He gave a single small nod, the signal we had agreed on, confirmation that the side gate was unlocked and the truck was close enough to reach in under 10 minutes if needed. I felt my own pulse settle into something slow and deliberate, the particular calm that had replaced fear somewhere over these past several months. The calm of a man who had spent 40 years learning exactly how much pressure a piece of metal could hold before it finally, predictably gave way. I set down my wine glass, untouched all evening, on the nearest table, and began making my way toward the small, raised platform near the center of the courtyard, where Priya was preparing to say a few words to open the evening properly. I set my cane against the edge of the nearest table before I reached the platform. The sound of wood on iron, small but clean, cutting through 3 or 4 nearby conversations at exactly the right moment. Heads turned. Priya, standing near the microphone with a folded index card of notes in one hand, glanced toward the sound, and I watched something flicker briefly across her face when she saw me walking toward her without the cane. My back straight, my hands entirely unmistakably steady. The tremor that had defined me to this town for months, nowhere in evidence at all. "I'd like everyone to see something before Priya begins," I said. My voice came out level, not raised, carrying easily across a courtyard that had gone quiet enough now to hear it clearly. The voice I used to use when a vendor tried to short me on an order and needed to understand, without theater, that I knew exactly what had happened. Priya's smile held barely the particular effort of a woman recalibrating in real time. "Gus," she said, her voice warm and public, "we're just about to start the program. Why don't you—" Dad Nathaniel said, moving toward me from somewhere near the pavilion, his voice carrying an edge of concern I recognized as genuine. Whatever else about that evening turned out not to be. "What's going on?" I raised one hand toward him, not sharply, and he stopped where he was. Close enough to see my face clearly, far enough that he could not yet reach me. His eyes moved between me and Priya, and I watched, even in that first moment, a small crease of confusion form between his brows. The look of a man sensing the ground shift beneath him, without yet understanding which direction it was moving. "Des," I said without turning around. Now, I heard the side gate open behind me and a low engine sound as my truck eased through it and into the courtyard's rear access lane, exactly the route Des and I had walked twice the week before to confirm it would clear without incident. The crowd's attention split, some turning toward the truck, most still fixed on me. And I felt the particular held breath quality of a room understanding all at once that something had begun that none of them had been prepared for. The string quartet's music faltered and stopped mid-phrase, the musicians themselves craning to see what was happening, bows lowered halfway. Des and 2 men he'd arranged from the co-op pulled the canvas back from the truck bed and lifted the first sculpture down, carrying it carefully toward the platform on a furniture dolly. Witness catching the string lights along every curve and seam, I had spent 40 years and these past several months learning to trust my hands with again. They set it down gently on the platform beside me, and I rested one hand briefly against its surface, feeling the cool metal under my palm. Steel that had waited 22 years for this exact moment to finally arrive. A murmur moved through the crowd, the low, uncertain sound of people recognizing craftsmanship without yet understanding its significance. I watched several longtime patrons lean forward, genuinely startled by the quality of the work, unaware they were looking at anything more than an unusually fine piece of ironwork. Someone near the front already reaching for a phone to photograph it. A collector I recognized from El Paso, a woman who had purchased 2 gates from me years earlier, turned to her companion and said loudly enough that I caught it clearly, "That's a red fern, isn't it?" I'd know that seam work anywhere. The second and third pieces came off the truck in quick succession, the ledger's spiral catching the light differently than the others, its folded steel throwing shadows across the platform floor. Des positioned all 3 in a careful arc, facing the crowd, exactly as we had rehearsed twice in the empty workshop the week before, and stepped back to stand near the platform's edge, arms loose at his sides, watching the courtyard. with the alert stillness of a man ready to move if he needed to. Priya's composure held for one more moment, and then, watching the second and third pieces emerge from the truck bed, I saw the exact instant she understood. These were not simply beautiful sculptures making an unexpected appearance at her opening. I watched her count them. 1, 2, 3. I watched her face go very still. The particular stillness of someone doing arithmetic she had never expected to need to do again. Her wine glass frozen halfway to the small table beside her, her knuckles whitening slightly around the stem. These 3 pieces, I said, turning to address the full courtyard, now took me 22 years to finish. My late wife Marisol designed them the year before she died. I built them around scrap steel I pulled from a demolition site 15 years ago, a piece of county land that got rezoned under paperwork that never should have cleared, land that belonged at the time to a contractor named Ezekiel Voss. The name meant nothing to most of the crowd. I watched it mean everything to exactly one person. Watched the color drain slightly from her face, even as she kept her chin level, kept her posture composed, for the cameras and phones already turning toward the platform. I want everyone here tonight, I continued, my voice steady, to understand exactly what these pieces contain, and exactly why someone spent 7 years making very certain I never lived long enough or steady-handed enough to finish them. Not to hurt me outright. That would have raised questions, drawn attention, invited exactly this kind of scrutiny far too early. Instead, someone chose something quieter, something that would look to any doctor, to any neighbor, to any family member, watching from a comfortable distance, like nothing more than an old man's body finally beginning to fail him. I reached into my jacket and withdrew the folded pages Ruth had prepared, holding them up so the nearest rows of the crowd could see clearly. These are blood test results, confirming elevated lead and cadmium levels in my system, I said, my voice level and clear. And these are pharmacy records showing exactly where those chemicals came from, purchased under an account controlled by Priya Ansari Redfern for nearly 7 years, well before she married my son. A sound moved through the crowd, not quite a gasp, something quieter and heavier. 200 people processing the same sentence at slightly different speeds. I saw Mrs. Delgado's hand rise to cover her mouth. I saw the reporter from The Independent scribbling rapidly, no longer bothering to disguise that she was taking notes on something considerably larger than an opening night piece. Gus, Priya said, stepping forward, her voice shifting into something smooth and reasonable. The register I had heard her use 100 times to make another person feel like the problem. Sweetheart, you're confused, and that's completely understandable given everything you've been through. Let's not do this here. Not tonight. Priya, I said, keeping my voice even and unhurried. My hands were shaking badly. 8 months ago, because you were poisoning me. Slowly, carefully. They stopped shaking 3 weeks after I quit taking what you were bringing me. 200 people can watch me hold a hammer steady tonight if they need proof of that. I turned my hand palm up, held it out steady in the light for the crowd nearest me to see. Clearly not a single tremor visible. Dad Nathaniel said, his voice cracking on the single word, stepping toward me now with no hesitation at all, his face white beneath the string lights. What is she talking about, Priya? Tell him that's not. Priya's mouth opened and closed once, without producing a sound. The first time all evening I had watched her fail to find the right words immediately. I looked at my son, at 38 years of memory, standing 6 feet away from me in the string lights, and felt the grief of it move through me the way a wave moves through water. Real and complete, and somehow already beginning to pass through rather than stay. I don't believe you knew any of this. I told him honestly, in front of everyone gathered there, my voice softening only slightly. I believe you handed me that bottle every single morning because you loved me and genuinely thought you were helping. That's the part that isn't complicated for me, Nathaniel. I love you. I have never once stopped, not for a single day of this. He made a sound that wasn't quite a word, pressing one hand hard against his mouth, his shoulders beginning to shake. Priya's expression had gone somewhere I hadn't seen it go before, past composure, into something colder and more calculating. A woman running numbers in real time, searching the crowd for any version of this moment that might still end differently than the one currently unfolding. Her eyes moved once toward Aldo Reyes, standing near the edge of the crowd, and I watched him look away quickly, already calculating his own distance from whatever this evening was about to become. I raised my hand once toward the side gate. A single, clear signal. The gate opened, and the plainclothes detective Ruth had arranged moved through it with an unhurried purpose. Another uniformed officer following, a few steps behind, crossing the courtyard directly toward the platform, the crowd parting instinctively to let them through. Priya Ansari Redfern, the detective said, his voice calm and entirely without theater, which somehow made it land harder than shouting would have. We need you to come with us to answer questions regarding a financial fraud and endangerment investigation. Priya's wineglass slipped from fingers that had apparently stopped registering they were holding it, shattering against the courtyard stones. Red wine spreading dark across the pale concrete, like something final. What followed happened in the particular hush that settles over a crowd witnessing something it will spend years describing to people who weren't there. The officers moved Priya gently but firmly toward the gate. She did not resist. She did not speak. She looked once briefly at Nathaniel, an expression on her face I could not fully read and did not try to. I did not watch them all the way out. I turned instead toward the three sculptures beside me, resting one hand flat against the ledger's cool surface, and let the courtyard's noise fall away into something distant, unimportant, background static behind the particular silence gathering in my own chest. Somewhere near the pavilion, a glass set down carefully on a table. A child's voice, confused, asking a parent what was happening. The string lights swayed faintly overhead in a breeze that had nothing to do with anything. Someone's phone buzzed once, twice, unanswered. The catering staff near the far tables stood frozen mid-motion, a tray of small glasses held forgotten in someone's hands. A dog barked twice from somewhere beyond the fence line, ordinary and unbothered by any of it. I stood there with my hand on cold steel, breathing slowly, letting the moment simply be what it was, without reaching yet for any word to describe it. The metal beneath my palm, holding the last of the evening's warmth, the way it had held 22 years of waiting before tonight. Des appeared at my elbow after a while, though I could not have told you exactly how long, and set one hand briefly on my shoulder, without saying anything at all. I nodded once, not quite ready yet to turn and see whatever expression Nathaniel's face was holding, and simply stood there a moment longer, with my old friend beside me, and the three finished sculptures catching the last of the string lights, letting the courtyard's ordinary sounds slowly find their way back into hearing. The legal process moved the way these things always do, slowly at first, then in a rush, then slowly again, grinding forward with the impersonal machinery of prosecutors and paperwork that does not care how tired a man is by the time it finally finishes. I spent that first month mostly at the workshop, finishing small commissions I had let slide during everything else, letting the ordinary rhythm of the forge steady me the way it always had, one clean strike at a time. Ruth walked me through each development in her steady, factual way, sitting across from me in her office above the bookstore, with the same yellow legal pad and the same mechanical adding machine, explaining every step clearly without softening any of it. Priya was charged with aggravated assault by poisoning and financial fraud tied to the falsified loan collateral. The chemical evidence, combined with 7 years of dosage notes recovered from her deleted files, left her attorney very little room to negotiate. She accepted a plea in December. 8 years with the possibility of parole after 5, and a restitution order covering both my medical costs and the fraudulent loan itself. Her father, Rajiv Ansari, faced separate charges tied to the original rezoning bribery. The case reopened once Ruth's documentation reached the district attorney's office. He resigned from every civic board he still sat on within the week, quietly, without a public statement of any kind. Ezekiel Voss's daughter in Alpine gave a statement, I was told, moved several people in that courtroom to tears, describing what her father's ruined business had cost her family in the years after his complaint was quietly buried. Ruth passed along a message from her, afterward brief and simple, thanking me for finally making sure her father's name meant something again. I have not met her yet. I intend to when the timing feels right rather than forced. When I can sit across from her without either of us needing to perform gratitude or grief for the other's benefit. Aldo Reyes lost his broker's license entirely and faced his own fraud charges tied to the expedited loan. His name, once spoken with a certain casual respect around Marfa, now carried a different weight entirely whenever it came up, which was less and less often as the months went on. I saw him once from a distance, loading boxes into a truck outside his old office, and felt nothing sharper than a kind of tired recognition. The particular emptiness that follows when a person who once frightened you simply becomes small. The marriage between Nathaniel and Priya did not survive any part of it. She filed for divorce from the county jail 3 months after her arrest. A small, strange mercy I had not expected and did not fully understand, until Nathaniel explained it to me himself, sitting across my kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in late November. Thinner than I remembered him. Quieter, in a way that had nothing to do with performance. She told me once near the end that she never expected to actually fall for me. He said, staring down at his coffee rather than at me, that it wasn't part of the plan. I don't know if that's supposed to make it better or worse. I still can't decide. I told him I understood that particular difficulty better than he might think, and did not elaborate further, because some things a father explains to a son slowly, over years, rather than all at once, across a single kitchen table, on a cold November evening, with the coffee going lukewarm between them. Nathaniel moved out of the apartment he and Priya had shared, and into a small rental 2 streets from my own house, close enough that Elena could still walk over most afternoons after school. Ember tucked under one arm, chattering about whatever marine creature currently held her attention that week. Deep sea worms, or bioluminescent jellyfish, or the particular hunting habits of octopuses she had recently discovered. He started coming by the workshop some evenings, standing quietly near the door the way he used to as a boy. Not saying much, just watching me work. Sometimes staying an hour, sometimes only a few minutes, before finding some reason to leave. 3 weeks before Christmas, he asked me the question I had been waiting for, without knowing exactly how I wanted to answer it. "Could you still teach me?" he said, standing near the workbench with his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. "Properly this time. I know I don't deserve it, walking back in after everything, and I understand if the answer's no." I looked at him a long moment. My son, standing in the doorway of the workshop that had shaped most of my life, asking for something he clearly expected me to refuse. His shoulders braced, the way they used to brace before a disappointing report card. Some old childhood posture his body still remembered, even now. "Nobody truly deserves to learn anything," I told him finally. "You just show up, and you keep showing up, and eventually your hands remember what your heart already knew, whether you feel like you've earned it or not." I picked up a spare hammer from the bench and held it out to him, handle first, the way my own father had once held one out to me, in a shed outside Alpine, more than 60 years ago now. Come back Thursday. We'll start with the fire, and we'll see how far your hands are willing to go from there. He took the hammer, carefully turning it once in his open palm, the way I remembered him doing as a small boy, testing its weight. And something in his face shifted. Not quite relief, something quieter and more tentative than that. The particular look of a man being handed a second chance he had not been certain he would ever see offered to him again. Rain in the desert announces itself differently than rain anywhere else I have lived. It came that February night the way it always does out here. The sky first going a strange, heavy green over the Chinati Mountains, then breaking all at once, hard and sudden, drumming against the workshop's tin roof, loud enough that Nathaniel had to raise his voice to be heard over it. We had been working 3 months by then. Thursday evenings mostly, sometimes a Saturday when his schedule at the new job allowed it. He had taken a position at the hardware supplier in Alpine, steady work that let him keep the small rental near my house, and kept him close enough to Elena's school schedule that he never missed a pickup. He was slow in the workshop, deliberately, careful, in a way I recognized as his own particular caution rather than lack of talent. Testing every motion twice before committing to it fully. I had not pushed him faster than that pace wanted to go. Some things cannot be rushed without breaking something in the process, and I had learned that lesson thoroughly enough these past months to apply it patiently to my son as well as to Steele. That night, with rain hammering the roof, and lightning occasionally lighting the high window in flat white bursts, Nathaniel set down the file he'd been using on a scrap piece and looked at the 3 courthouse sculptures still standing in their arc near the far wall, where I had left them since the gallery opening, waiting for a permanent home at the county courthouse. Ruth had helped arrange for them, a small unveiling ceremony planned for the spring once the weather turned reliable again. "Do you think I'll ever actually hear it?" he asked. "The way you do, what the metal's telling you." I set my own tools down and considered the question honestly before answering it. "I don't know," I told him. "Some people never do, no matter how many years they put in. It's not entirely about effort. It's about a kind of listening most people spend their whole lives too busy or too frightened to practice." "Were you ever frightened of it?" he asked. "Listening, I mean." I thought about Marisol's letter still folded in the box on the shelf where I kept it, now no longer hidden, but not carried against my chest daily either, resting instead in its proper place among everything else she had left me. I thought about 15 years of silence regarding a rezoning I had known on some level was wrong from the very beginning. I thought about Priya sitting in Marisol's green chair, about photographs I had never had, about every small warning sign I had heard clearly enough and chosen each time not to trust. I spent most of my life believing that patience was the same thing as wisdom, I told him. That waiting long enough to be certain was always the responsible choice. I have come to understand those are not the same thing at all. Sometimes waiting is wisdom. Sometimes it's just fear wearing a more respectable name. And a man can spend decades unable to tell the two apart if nobody ever forces him to look closely enough. Nathaniel was quiet a long moment, rain filling the space between us where words might otherwise have gone. He set the scrap piece down entirely, turning to face me directly for the first time since the question had started. And now he finally asked, "What do you believe now?" I looked at the 3 finished sculptures catching the workshop's low light, at my son standing across from me with a file still loosely held in one hand, at the door I had once stood in this exact same spot, deciding whether to open on a rainy November night, not so different from this one. He had shown up soaked through, a duffel bag at his feet, asking for somewhere to stay while he figured things out. His voice wrecked in a way I had never heard from him before, not even at his mother's funeral. I had let myself see him clearly that night, the soaked jacket, the face I had known since before he could speak. And I had told him I loved him, the way a father is supposed to love a son, without keeping score, without conditions. And then I had told him it would not be rebuilt here, not at my expense, again, and closed the door, and listened to him cry in the rain on my porch until the sound of his own truck finally pulled away into the dark, toward wherever he was staying those first hard weeks. I had not known, standing in that doorway, whether closing it gently was the right choice, or simply the only choice a man exhausted past the point of certainty had left in him. I still do not entirely know, 3 months and 1 workshop apprenticeship later, watching him work a file across scrap steel with more patience than I had expected him to bring to anything ever again. What I do know is that the door had not stayed closed forever. It had simply stayed closed long enough for both of us to become slowly and separately people capable of walking back through it, honestly. Now I believe the metal tells you the truth the moment it's ready to, I said. Your job is just to be listening closely enough at exactly that moment to hear it. Not before you're ready. Not after you've stopped paying attention. Right when it happens. He nodded, slowly turning the file over once in his hand, and picked the scrap piece back up, setting the edge against it carefully. The sound of metal on metal joining the rain against the roof. 2 rhythms finding, gradually, an uneasy kind of harmony. Neither of us tried to name out loud. Outside, the storm showed no sign of easing, and neither of us moved to end the evening early. Content, for the first time in longer than either of us would likely admit. Simply to keep working side by side, until the rain decided on its own schedule to finally let up. The 3 sculptures stand at the county courthouse now, in an alcove near the entrance where the morning light finds them first. If you walked past them on your way to file a deed or pay a fine, you might notice only the craftsmanship, 40 years of a steady hand finally trusted again. You would have to know exactly where to look, exactly what a certain seam means, exactly how one man taught himself to read metal the way other men read scripture, to understand what else is written there, quietly waiting for anyone patient enough to ask the right question. For most of my life, I believed that patience was the same thing as wisdom, that a man who waited long enough, who gave people the benefit of every doubt, who trusted his own family completely and without condition, was doing the right thing, the honorable thing. I have come to understand, slower than I would like to admit, that patience and fear can wear the exact same face. Sometimes waiting is wisdom. Sometimes it is simply the story we tell ourselves so we never have to find out what we would have seen had we only looked sooner. What I know now is this. The people who love you most will sometimes fail you. Not because love was ever false, but because love and fear can live in the very same heart without either one canceling the other out. And the people who wish you harm will often show you exactly who they are. In the small dismissals, the quiet corrections, the gentle assumption that you are too old, too slow, too trusting to notice. I noticed eventually. I simply waited far too long to trust what I was noticing. God gave me the clarity to see it before it was entirely too late. And I am grateful for that every single day. Do not wait the way I waited. If something in your chest tells you a person is not who they claim to be, listen the first time. If you have ever loved someone who used that love against you, and still found somewhere underneath the wreckage that the love itself never quite left you, already understand the particular kind of grief I am describing. It does not resolve cleanly. It simply learns slowly how to sit beside you. If you were standing in that doorway in the rain, with everything you had built on one side and everything you had lost on the other, would you have opened the door or closed it? I still ask myself that question some nights, and I still do not have a clean answer. Tell me yours in the comments. I read every single one. If this story found something true in you today, Share it with someone who needs to hear that it is never too late to trust your own two hands again. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. And if you believe an old man finally deserved to be heard, leave that behind for him too. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know.